Good afternoon and welcome to this month's Employee Benefits Compliance webinar. As we get started today, as we often do, we would like to start by kicking off with a polling question. This one's actually on topic with today's webinar. We are going to ask you, what is your top health plan fiduciary priority over the next 12 months? So as we are getting started here, if you would take a moment and provide your response, we'd certainly appreciate it. And as you are doing so, again, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. I am Jenny Badeau with Assurex Global, and today the Loomlight team will be reviewing ERISA fiduciary duties. This topic continues to get attention, and we're certainly grateful to the Loomlight team for being here with us today to educate us over the next hour or so on key considerations. And we would like to extend a special thank you to your local benefits advisors and consultants who are partners of Assurex Global for making this webinar series possible. We do welcome your questions during the presentation today. You can submit those over to us using that Q&A function towards the bottom of your screen. We will address as many of those questions as we can throughout our time here today. And if you have just joined us, you will see a polling question up on your screen. Please do take a second and provide your response to that if you're able to. And I will mention too, we do record our presentations, so a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides will be available early next week from the benefits advisor who invited you here today. And I will also drop a link to the presentation slides into our chat section here in just a couple of minutes. And I think polling responses are still coming in. I'll leave that up for just a couple moments. And I will mention too, we will have a poll pop up during our presentation as well, kind of on topic to one portion of our presentation. So just a quick kind of heads up that you'll see another poll kind of partway through our presentation today as well. Okay. So responses are still coming in. I'll share these out in just a moment. But as it stands right now, managing plan costs while reducing litigation risk, almost half of you are saying that's your top priority, followed by strengthening internal fiduciary education and training coming in at number 2. All right. Okay, so you can see those results there. So again, thank you to everyone who was able to provide your responses. We certainly appreciate you taking the time to do so. But with that, we will get into today's content. So joining us today from the Loomlight team, we have Regan Debin, Director of Compliance Consulting, and Brianna Barnett, Compliance Advisor. So team, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. You're going to start off with me today. I hope today we can help some of you that put kind of education and training on your list to help you kind of understand which pieces you understand, which pieces you have questions, kind of get you started in the right direction, and then maybe go back to your broker advisor to reach out and see what more you can do to kind of build on your current fiduciary duty responsibilities and understanding those and making sure that you're protected in the way that you're comfortable with. As Jenny mentioned, there really has been a lot of litigation around this, starting kind of back in 2024 and certainly continuing with another wave of lawsuits that were filed just early in 2026. And for that reason, we don't have any new rules or regulations around this necessarily. We obviously have a lot of transparency and reporting and different things that are providing you with more information, but the general kind of ERISA fiduciary duty basics are unchanged, but they're just kind of under attack right now, and employers are taking some heat, being accused of not complying with those. We saw quite a bit in the retirement space about a decade ago that started and kind of really picked up and made some real changes around managing retirement benefits, and now we're seeing those kind of same things happening with health and welfare benefits. And so we just thought this was a perfect opportunity to, we're going to start with an overview of the fiduciary litigation and what we're seeing and what's happening and what that might mean, kind of what they're going after, what different companies are being accused of. And then we'll jump into the basics. Then I'm going to have Brianna step in and talk about fiduciary roles and responsibilities. And then some of the key things that we see that employers really need to be paying attention to as kind of pieces of those roles and responsibilities. So handling plan assets, plan compliance and auditing, vendor management. Then we'll kind of wrap up at the very end, talk about some of the common fiduciary struggles. Where do employers have a hard time kind of putting it all together and maybe managing all of it, the way that you indicated, and kind of balancing that against planned costs and things, and in all honesty, just time, right? And then give you a checklist of sorts to kind of look at, to walk through managing that fiduciary risk. So with that, we'll start off with fiduciary litigation, just giving you a bit of background, level setting with where we're at today. As I mentioned, this really kind of started back in 2024 to 2025. We saw a ton of different cases being very big employers. So we saw those in the headlines. And so we've got some of the names here. I'm sure you're probably familiar and saw a lot of these in the news. Johnson & Johnson, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase. These cases all primarily focused on pharmacy benefit managers and prescription drug coverage under these employers' plan, and then kind of their fiduciary responsibilities related to managing those relationships and their cost design and coverage. So the primary allegations in those cases, they all were different flavors of kind of the same thing. They were imprudent selection and monitoring of their pharmacy benefit managers, inadequate oversight of drug pricing and rebates, just what they were, how the drugs were actually priced for plan participants, how those rebates were being handled between the employer and the pharmacy benefit manager, failure to monitor administrative fees and formulary design, just how those decisions were being made about ultimately how the plan was paying for the administration of the plan, how they were making decisions or allowing the PBM to make decisions about which drugs were making the formulary and at which tier. And then undisclosed or kind of poorly managed conflicts of interest or self-dealing, where they felt that there may have been relationships or different kickbacks, compensation that played into ultimately how some of these decisions were being made versus being made in the best interest of plan participants, which is what we're really supposed to be doing. The reality with most of these cases is that they've been dismissed. And so the employers didn't end up getting in trouble or necessarily having to make any changes that were court ordered. That doesn't mean that they're not potentially making some changes and adjustments now based on these claims, but they weren't court ordered things that had to happen. That being the case, even if it's dismissed, that doesn't eliminate that they've been in the news and they were accused of these things. So what does that do to an employer's reputation? And they had to spend a lot of time and money fighting those legal claims, which also is not a great thing and something obviously we all want to avoid. These were all after, again, like we pointed out, pretty major employers. We're not necessarily seeing as much of this with a small to mid-size employer. That doesn't mean that those claims couldn't still be brought, or that they might not be some, kind of class action things, or that you might not just run into issues with employees kind of accusing and pointing these things out to a federal agency that would trigger an audit. So just good things to be watching and aware of where they're deciding that there was fault versus not for these employers. Then the next thing that we saw was just early in 2026, we saw 4 additional claims filed. They're brand new. We haven't seen any real action on these yet, so we're waiting to see how these played out. But still just interesting, they really took a turn in a different direction, and they all involved voluntary benefit arrangements. So think of your critical illness, hospital indemnity, even some of the life insurance, disability are offered or managed on a voluntary basis. That is interesting, first of all, because a lot of times I think we assume that those types of benefits aren't subject to ERISA in the first place. And so this litigation is poking at that, and the safe harbor, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment in more detail, and arguing that a lot of these arrangements really are subject to ERISA and that ERISA fiduciary duties do apply. The other kind of interesting angle on these particular cases is that they've been pulling in consultants and brokers as parties in interest. They play a large role in ultimately helping put the parties together, and may have some compensation involved in putting, in how these benefits are offered, how they're ultimately paid for, that relationship with the carrier. So again, we're just kind of watching to see how all of this plays out, but it could potentially change a bit how employers handle these benefits, and for sure how they're monitoring these vendors and the fees and the compensation that are involved in these types of arrangements. In these particular cases, the allegations were, again, kind of similar to what we saw before, but instead of being with pharmacy benefit managers focused on the carriers involved with these voluntary benefits, failure to prudently select and monitor service providers, failure to monitor, control, and leverage kind of their planned bargaining power to limit broker and consultant compensation, which then, ultimately is probably being passed on to the plan participants and that they're paying more for that coverage. And then knowing participation in prohibited transactions. Again, kind of that idea of self-interest, self-dealing. Are we really making decisions in the best interests of our plan participants? As I mentioned, one of the things that we're really watching here is how will they come down as far as which voluntary benefits are subject to ERISA and which ones are not. If we can make the argument that the plans aren't subject to ERISA, we don't ever get to that ERISA fiduciary duty argument. But I think the reality is that a lot of voluntary benefit plan arrangements don't meet all the requirements to be exempt from ERISA, and so that we've got those up here. The requirements are that there can't be any employer contributions. So the employees have to pay for 100% of the premiums each month. Participation must be completely voluntary, so they can't have any type of auto enrollment or requirement that all employees participate in the benefits. And the employer involvement has to be extremely limited. The only thing that they're really permitted to do is to publicize the benefits so that employees know that they're available, and then play the role that they need to play in collecting the after-tax employee contributions, typically through payroll. There can't be any type of employer endorsement is the kind of that limited involvement role building on that. And there are a variety of different things that fall in this area that we're not really sure, but would very likely be viewed as endorsing the plan. So for example, selecting the insurance company and saying, this is the one that we're going to use. Using the employer's name or logo on the benefit materials instead of just leaving it all under the vendor's name and kind of using their advertising, designating the employer as the plan administrator, sponsor, or trustee in kind of documentation and other places, even just recommending the plan to employees, kind of being involved in that and pushing them that direction. Probably the most common one that we see is a lot of the vendors will offer to help kind of administer Section 125 plans along with their voluntary benefit offerings, and allowing employees to pay premiums pre-tax through a cafeteria plan. That's technically permitted under IRS rules and from a compliance perspective for a lot of these benefits to let them pay at least a portion of it on a pre-tax basis. But that would definitely move it outside of this ERISA safe harbor. If that is happening, that's definitely employer involvement at that point. And then, of course, assisting employees with claims and disputes. Again, kind of getting involved in that plan administrator sponsor role is another way that they would really lose the safe harbor. It's really tough to meet all these requirements for employers that are sponsoring these, I shouldn't say sponsoring, that are offering these benefits to their employees. We have recommended for a long time that employers are much safer off assuming that these benefits are subject to ERISA and then acting accordingly. So as we kind of look at the bucket of cases, I put them in kind of two for now, and we expect that this momentum is just going to continue. I don't know kind of where the target will be next. For now, we're just watching to see how this plays out with the voluntary benefits. But two kind of key takeaways before we jump into the ERISA fiduciary basics from this litigation. First of all, really important to understand which plans are subject to ERISA and make sure that you know where you have that responsibility of the ERISA fiduciary duties. And then at second, and this is really what we're going to focus the rest of our time on today, is understanding the employer's fiduciary role. So assuming that your benefits, or at least a portion of your benefits, are subject to ERISA, understanding the fiduciary role and the responsibilities that come with that, and making sure that you understand how to implement appropriate processes and documentation practices for that. And with that, Brianna, I'll let you jump in and we'll go through those things.
All right, thanks, Reagan, and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to move from litigation to discussing what the roles and responsibilities of a fiduciary actually are as defined under ERISA. So we've thrown that word around, but now let's see what ERISA actually requires. So a fiduciary is anyone who exercises discretionary authority or control over the administration of a plan or the management of its assets. So in other words, if you have decision-making power over how the plan operates or how plan assets are handled, then you are acting as a fiduciary. So fiduciary status is about function and it's about influence, not necessarily a formal title. So there are two primary types of fiduciaries. There's a named fiduciary. So this is an individual or a position or sometimes even a committee, like if you have a fiduciary committee established that is specifically identified in plan documentation or vendor contracts, for example, as having fiduciary responsibility. So their role is formally designated and documented as opposed to a functional fiduciary. So this person may not be specifically named in any document, but if they are performing fiduciary functions, then they are treated as a fiduciary. So one important fact to note at the bottom, as you can see, the employer plan sponsor is always a fiduciary by default. So that is the one title that matters, right? So even if certain duties are delegated to service providers or to certain committees, the plan sponsor retains fiduciary responsibility under ERISA regardless. But as you can see in the next slide, not every single action related to a benefit plan is a fiduciary act. So some decisions are considered settler or business decisions, while others carry fiduciary responsibility. On the left side, we have the fiduciary decisions. So these, again, are actions that involve managing or administering the plan in the best interest of the plan and its participants. So for example, appointing other plan fiduciaries is a fiduciary act because you're selecting individuals who will have authority over the plan. Selecting and monitoring plan vendors is also another fiduciary responsibility. It's not enough to just hire a provider, but ERISA requires ongoing oversight, and we're going to discuss that more in depth as well. Assessing plan compliance, approving or denying claims, as well as disclosing potential conflicts of interest, all involve discretion and judgment that directly impact plan participants. So on the right, by contrast, are these business decisions. So these are decisions that the employer makes in its role as plan sponsor, not as a fiduciary. So for example, deciding whether to establish a plan in the first place is a business decision. Determining the benefit structure or determining which employees are eligible, amending the plan design, or even terminating the plan as well. So while these decisions do affect employees significantly, right, they are not fiduciary acts under ERISA if they don't meet that primary definition, right? Exercising discretionary authority or control. So at the heart of all of the fiduciary responsibility is one overarching principle, and that is to act in the best interest of plan participants and beneficiaries. But ERISA codified these principles into fiduciary duties in Section 404A. So let's start with the duty of care and the duty of skill. All that ERISA requires is that fiduciary decisions be informed, that they be researched, and that they be well documented. So fiduciaries don't have to be experts in every arena, but they must either have the appropriate expertise or seek guidance from qualified professionals when needed. Next is the duty of loyalty. This goes back to the conflicts of interest discussion that Reagan began and will continue later on. So this just means acting solely in the interest of plan participants, not in the interest of the company, not in personal interest, and not for the benefit of third parties. So plan decisions must prioritize the plan's financial well-being above all else. And closely related to this is the duty of prudence. So prudence focuses on the process used to make decisions, right? We've talked about the fact that they have to be well informed, they have to be documented, but this focuses on the actual process when making decisions. So even if an outcome doesn't turn out as expected, a fiduciary can still demonstrate compliance by showing they followed a thoughtful, well-documented, and reasonable decision-making process. On the right side of the slide, we summarize what these duties look like in practice. I mentioned them a little bit before. So fiduciaries must engage in informed decision-making, avoid conflicts of interest, and ensure legal compliance with ERISA and other applicable laws. Again, Reagan will touch on the conflicts of interest portion, but I'm going to define it really quickly since it's a novel term, right? So a conflict of interest just occurs when any fiduciary's personal interest, business interest, or relationships could interfere or even appear to interfere with their obligation to act solely in the best interest of the plan. So, for example, a conflict could exist if a fiduciary selects a service provider that they have a financial interest in, if they receive compensation tied to a certain investment option, if they favor vendors due to personal relationships, or even make decisions that reduce costs for the employer but negatively impact the plan and its participants overall. So, even if the decision seems reasonable, right, the presence of competing interests can create risks. So here's how ERISA fiduciary duties look practically. So as I touched on before, fiduciaries must act solely in the best interest of participants and beneficiaries. They also must use a prudent, well-informed process for all decisions, right? But they also are required to follow the plan documents meticulously, right? As long as those documents are consistent with ERISA. So the plan document is the governing framework, and operations must align with its terms. Deviating from the plan document, even unintentionally, can create compliance risk. Another critical responsibility is selecting and monitoring service providers. So this includes TPAs, right, third-party administrators, PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, as well as other vendors. So hiring a provider is not a one-time event. Fiduciaries must periodically review performance, services, and fees to ensure that they are reasonable. And then speaking of fees, right, ERISA requires that compensation paid to service providers be reasonable. This doesn't necessarily mean the lowest cost, but it does mean that fees must be appropriate for the services provided. Fiduciaries must also provide accurate and timely communications to participants. ERISA has very strict disclosure timelines for some of these, so it's good to make sure that you're on point with what ERISA requires. And then finally, everything should be documented. So this includes decisions, reviews, corrections, and oversight activities to create a clear audit trail of compliant plan operations. And now I'm going to shift back to Reagan to discuss more.
Thanks, Brianna. I think just kind of you hit it home with that last one. A really big piece of this is not always getting everything right. We're all going to make some mistakes, and decisions that, look like they're in the best interest of our participants today might not play out the way that we expect and might be different down the road. But ultimately, kind of doing what you're best, what you think is best at the time, and ultimately documenting. Documenting is so key here to say, hey, this is what we looked at. This is why we made this decision. We really intended this to be in the best interest of plan participants, will go a long way in really providing an employer defense around their fiduciary duties, even if ultimately it plays out differently and not in a good way. The next thing I want to touch on is handling plan assets. So obviously, handling the money that's going in and out of the plan is huge. And that's where a lot of the claims come in, that ultimately plan participants are having to pay too much for premiums. They're having to pay more than they should for different cost sharing under the plan. Claims aren't being processed in a way, that ultimately they're being underpaid, and participants are ending up spending more. That's often a big piece of what employers are being accused of, that ultimately plan participants are being harmed financially. So handling plan assets is really key as far as an ERISA fiduciary duty. So what does that mean? What are plan assets when we use that term? It's money that belongs to plan participants. So certainly the participant contributions, those belong to the plan and are considered to be plan assets. If you get money from the insurance dividends or refunds or rebates, sometimes even a court settlement. That doesn't happen super often, but being paid back to the plan, that's typically treated as plan assets and has to be handled accordingly. And then employer funds, in some cases, it's not as common, but some employers will actually put their funds in a separate trust or a VEBA. And once it goes into that trust, then it is considered to be a plan asset. It can no longer be pulled back by the employer and used for other things. Once it's in that trust, it becomes plan assets. Anything that gets labeled as plan assets then ultimately has to be used solely for the benefit of plan participants. When we say that, that's not always going to be directly paying premiums or claims under the plan. There is some room to pay administrative expenses, to pay those different vendors and the fees that go along with putting those vendors in place to administer the plan, compliance costs. So think of things that employers have to do for their plans like non-discrimination testing, Form 5500 filings. They may have to pay fees to go and do that, to do compliance assessments from time to time. And then, of course, paying the claims under the plan for a self-funded plan or the insurance premiums that get paid, those would obviously be valid expenses as well. But outside of those things, and there may be a few more examples, but outside of those types of things, if it is considered to be plan assets, it can't be used outside of those things. If ultimately, so for example, for a self-funded plan, we end up with a significant surplus, the employer doesn't get to just keep that if a portion of that or all of that is considered to be plan assets versus money that's being paid out of the employer's general assets. And to the extent that it's plan assets, they would have to find a way to use that for plan participants. Perhaps they're bumping up the level of benefits available. Maybe they're providing a premium holiday to plan participants, but finding different ways to add additional value or ultimately make sure that that's going back to plan participants versus being held by the employer. Tied in with this is the timing of handling that money. And this is a common question that we get as we tackle questions from employers every day, is around, as we're collecting money, especially from payroll, how quickly do we have to make sure that those participant contributions get to where they're supposed to go? Now, if it's a self-funded plan and you're collecting employee contributions, you're holding on to that, typically not in a trust, but the employer's just general assets, and then they're paying out claims as they come in. So we don't have a timing issue there. The employer can just kind of hold on to those until they're used, or a health FSA, they're holding on to those, or and then using them when reimbursement is requested. But most of the time, that money is going to an insurance carrier for premiums. So we have to make sure that we're timely paying those. In other cases, they have to make it available for an FSA or for an HSA, for example, depositing it into an account. And the turnaround is pretty quick. When we're handling plan participant contributions, the rules say that we're supposed to get those to where they're supposed to go within 2 to 3 business days, as soon as administratively feasible. As soon as you collect it from payroll and you can reasonably kind of separate it out, know which portion is participant contributions, we're supposed to send that in whichever direction it's supposed to go next. They do recognize that sometimes things happen. We're changing administrators, we're changing vendors for bank accounts, those types of things, but for sure within 90 days. But that has to really kind of be the exception. More often than not, we're supposed to be moving those funds to where they need to go very quickly. I did mention just briefly that sometimes employers hold all of the funds, participant contributions and employer contributions. They take all of those and they segregate those and put them in a separate account under maybe under the plan's name. That's one way that they could do it rather than the employer's name, or they put it in a formal trust or VEBA. And if that's how the employer decides to handle that money, it has a special name for ERISA purposes. We call it a funded plan. That's completely different than fully insured versus a self-insured or self-funded plan. That's not what we're talking about here. It's looking specifically at how the plan is funded. So it's a funded plan when we take all employee and employer contributions and move them away from the employer. We segregate them from the rest of the employer's general assets, and then it's considered to be a funded plan. And then that's where, once the employer contributions go into that, they are now plan assets. They can't back that out and do anything that they want with them. Not a lot of employers voluntarily choose to set their plans up this way because of those restrictions, creating them, making them plan assets. Then they're really obligated to use them just solely to benefit plan participants. But sometimes it's required. Government employers sometimes are required to set plans up as a funded plan. There's a collectively bargained agreement in place. Union employees, they might be required to hold those funds separately in a trust. Sometimes nonprofits, their boards will require that that's how they have things set up. And I do realize that in some cases, there's some tax savings that can be available for employers who choose to run things through a VEBA instead. But the reality is that most employers fund their plans from their general assets. They're collecting those employee contributions, just putting them in with their general assets, and then ultimately paying fees out of their general assets. When the employer handles it that way, it's considered to be an unfunded plan. To the extent that the dollars then are left over, it does give the employer a little bit more flexibility. They maybe put a certain amount aside as kind of a budgeted amount, and they know, hey, this is what we think we might have to pay out this year. But then ultimately, if they have a good year and there's money left over, there's flexibility for the employer to take that back and use it for any planned business expenses anywhere that they want to. It doesn't have to be used necessarily for the plan. Then I also want to touch on prohibited transactions. We've talked about this, just a bit. A lot of times it's related to the plan assets, which is why we threw it here. It's tied into compensation or fees that are being paid. Conflicts of interest, transactions with parties in interest, when there's a relationship involved, self-dealing or receipt of consideration. Those are all things that we just want to be really careful about, to the extent that it could be tied in any way to plan assets. And I'm going to switch gears again. We're going to talk just a little bit about, we've talked about kind of the who's a fiduciary, plan assets. Now jump into another portion that we think is really key, and just do plan compliance and auditing. What should you do around this? What does this mean? So the first thing that we want to talk about is plan documentation. Brianna mentioned that this is one of the responsibilities that you have as a fiduciary. As the employer and plan sponsor, you're maybe picking the plans, picking the design, making some of the decisions around that. But one of the things you're doing in your fiduciary role is making sure that that's properly documented. ERISA specifically requires that plans have plan documentation, and that there's a summary plan description or an SPD that's distributed to plan participants. And we have really specific rules under ERISA as far as that content. They don't say it has to look exactly like a certain template, but they give us a bunch of different components that they expect to see somewhere in all plan documentation. So I've got some of the key things here. Right in that plan document, we're expected to designate a named fiduciary. We're supposed to list out and explain the benefits and the eligibility for those benefits. Describe the funding. This goes back to what I just talked about before, whether the plan is funded or unfunded. That's supposed to be specified in the plan document. Procedures for allocating the different plan responsibilities and who's going to do different things. This is where you're potentially listing out your different carriers, TPAs, PBMs, other vendors that you're working with, to let plan participants know where they're getting those different benefits. Plan amendment and termination procedures, we're supposed to document those so that we've decided on kind of a plan, and then ultimately if we need to make those things happen, we're following those procedures. And then a bunch of required notices, and these are more so for group health plans and some of the other benefits, but we're supposed to set forth in the plan documentation participants' ERISA rights, their COBRA rights, their HIPAA protections. Those are just a couple examples. There are quite a few. When you look at your plan document, kind of goes through everything that's describing the plan first, and then it gives a lot of the rights and responsibilities under these different federal laws as the second portion of your documentation. We have to be really careful that we're documenting these things, but then also that it matches. Sometimes we have multiple different documents all describing a particular benefit. It really is your job as a fiduciary to make sure that your documentation, the various pieces of that, are consistent. And then ultimately that as you're making choices about how to administer the plan and overseeing your service vendors and how they're administering the plan, that ultimately that's being handled consistently with how things have been documented. Then the next thing that you really should be thinking about, this is not something that you necessarily need to be doing every year, but certainly something that's a good idea to do on an occasional basis. And these are two different kinds of audits, eligibility audits and claims audits, but regular audits of plan eligibility and claims processing are a good way for you to monitor things, to help identify errors, to prevent fraud, to make sure, like what I was just talking about, that the way that things are happening is matching, the people that are covered under your plan actually match up with your eligibility rules, or the way that claims are being processed is really following the way that you've got your schedule of benefits and the way that you've said as far as timeframes and things that are being approved and that process for going through that approval or denial. And then, of course, protecting plan assets, just making sure that money is being spent the way that you expected it to be. So eligibility audits is just like what it sounds like. We're looking not only at employees, that's perhaps a little bit easier for employers to manage and know which employees are meeting their hours requirement or in the appropriate class, that type of thing, to make sure that they've only got eligible employees on their plan. But I will say we see lots with leaves of absences and different things that you want to be careful about. Perhaps more importantly, where you might not have as much visibility is spouses and dependents. And employees, if you're relying on their attestation or just their enrollment forms to let them enroll family members, do those family members really meet your plan eligibility rules? And what are you doing to make sure that that's the case and you don't have ineligible individuals on your plan that are potentially driving up claims and costing the rest of the participants money, that type of thing. The other thing is the claims audits then. And so then what we recommend is that you're taking a sample of paid claims, ensuring that they comply with your plan terms, coding accuracy, appropriate application of cost sharing, correct coordination of benefits, making sure that all those things are happening the way that they should. The reality is you can do some of this yourself. There are vendors out there as well that can potentially run these audits for you. Maybe every 3 to 5 years you decide to do that or hire that out to make sure that your plan is operating the way that it's expected. I do think now here we were going to pause. Jenny, I think you had another poll to throw in that ties into this.
Yeah, thanks, Reagan. So we did think this might just be an interesting kind of couple of data points to collect. So we do have two polling questions that should be popping up on your screen. First, we are asking, how often does your company conduct an eligibility audit? And second, you'll see we are asking, how often does your company conduct a claims audit? And the answer options are the same between the two. So please take a moment and let us know. And again, just thought this would be interesting to kind of review where everyone is at with these.
And as I mentioned before, this really could be something that you're doing to some level yourself internally, or it could be something that you're hiring a third party occasionally to come in and help with these.
And we'll leave this up for just a minute because I'm still seeing quite a few responses coming in, but I always like to give a sneak peek. So on the eligibility, we are seeing actually about 40+% are saying they're doing an eligibility audit about every year. And that's actually a little bit higher than what I would have expected. But of course, interestingly, the second most popular response is we've never done an audit. So kind of two ends of the spectrum there. And then for the claims audit, almost half of you are saying you have never done this. So probably not a surprise there, and then kind of a mix of responses across the other options.
And admittedly, the claims audits are a little bit harder. I think most of the time you're going to have the information you need to do the eligibility audits. You're potentially having to reach out to employees to get some additional information about family members, but you can do that and get access to that much more easily than sometimes the claims information is harder to get, whether it's from your carrier or your TPA or PBM. I just want to recognize that that can sometimes be a challenge to get the level of data that you want.
Yeah. All right, I will share these out and I will let Reagan continue on. So you can see here, again, with that eligibility audit, just under half of you are doing that every year. And again, with that claims audit, about half of you have never done that. So again, thanks everyone for providing your responses there. And Reagan, I will turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right, so kind of continuing along the same path in regards to compliance and auditing, in addition to just kind of the plan documentation and make sure that you're following that, the other thing that you're really expected to do is make sure that you're keeping the plan aligned with general benefit compliance requirements. So the plan document, not only do you do it once, you need to make sure that you're reviewing that, keeping that up to date, especially in regard to if you're making changes to eligibility, if you're making changes to service vendors, making sure of that all of that is correctly reflected in your most current plan document, or making amendments accordingly. And then every once in a while, you're grabbing all of those amendments, right, and cleaning it up, doing a restatement and making sure that you've got it in good shape. Notice distributions, Brianna mentioned that already, but think about all of the different notices that we're required to give out when individuals are newly eligible for the plan, as well as annually when they're going through open enrollment. Sometimes other times scattered throughout the year, but making sure that you've got those on hand, got the most current versions available, and that you're timely distributing those. We've got quite a bit of reporting, and we've seen more of this really get added over the last couple of years in regard specifically to group health plans in most cases. But a couple that we point out here: ACA employer reporting, creditable coverage reporting to CMS about your prescription drug coverage. If you have a large enough plan, Form 5500 filings, the prescription drug reporting, and the gag clause attestations. Those are all things that you have to do and report information about your plan and your offering to the different agencies. And then it's always a good idea to do compliance assessments, but I recognize the effort that is required to do some of those things. So similar to the audits, this isn't necessarily something that you're doing every year. Maybe you're doing a portion of it one year and another portion of it the next year, but going through a high-level checklist of sorts that looks at ERISA and COBRA and 125 and HIPAA and the mental health parity rules, all of those different things, and just making sure that you've got kind of a base understanding of what those things are and what you're doing to make sure that your plan is in compliance, and obviously getting some help with some of those things to make sure that you're set up correctly or that you've got vendors in place to help with that. And that's what my next slide is about here. It's a lot of these things that you need to be doing. You can't do them on your own. Not only do you not, have all the knowledge to make all of these decisions if this isn't something that you're doing day in and day out. So then remember, you're asking for help from people in the industry and from your advisor that invited you here today to get in touch with the right parties. A lot of the compliance obligations themselves can't be handled by the employer alone. You really have to rely heavily on your vendors to do that. And I've got a ton of examples of those here. And that's where, especially with self-funded plans, fully insured plans, you certainly still have ERISA fiduciary obligations if you're a fully insured plan. You are still handling participant contributions. You are still making sure that you've got documentation in place and that that's being followed and that you're distributing notices timely. There are quite a few things that you're still doing, but it's definitely heightened for self-funded plan sponsors. They have to do a lot more, and that's where what Brianna's going to focus on next with managing vendors, kind of picking vendors, ongoing monitoring of those vendors, making sure that they're really helping you with these things is crucial.
All right, thanks, Reagan. And we actually did get a question about vendor management and vendor oversight. So I hope this will extend the answer you were already given regarding this. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we refer to plan vendors, these are the categories we're referring to. We're referring to third-party administrators or TPAs, right? They handle many of the day-to-day administrative functions, including claim processing, eligibility tracking and compliance support, pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs, the ones who manage the prescription drug component of the plan, the ones who negotiate with drug manufacturers, manage formularies and process pharmacy claims, insurance carriers, benefits consultants and brokers who often assist with plan design, vendor selection, renewals, and market analyses, wellness program providers as well as health savings account administrators, HSA vendors, are additional vendors that may support the overall benefits ecosystem. So again, each of these vendors perform several important and distinct functions, but fiduciary responsibility still cannot be outsourced. So employers must prudently select, monitor, and document oversight of all service providers to ensure they are acting in the best interest of plan participants. So selecting a vendor requires a thoughtful, well-documented evaluation process, and here are some criteria to help with that. First, consider customer service. So this includes responsiveness, accessibility, issue resolution, and overall participant experience. Since vendors often interact directly with employees, service quality directly impacts participant experience and participant satisfaction. Next is technology and innovation. So in today's environment, vendors should offer secure, efficient, and user-friendly platforms, strong reporting capabilities, data security protocols, and system integration are oftentimes required, especially under HIPAA, right? You want to make sure employee information is safe and secured. Scope of services is also a big one. So does the vendor provide the specific services your plan needs? Do you need to contract with several vendors, or is one sufficient? So this just helps prevent misunderstandings, and it narrows the scope in terms of what the plan actually needs. Regulatory compliance. So vendors must also demonstrate that they understand and comply with applicable laws and regulations. So this includes ERISA's requirements, as well as privacy standards and any industry-specific obligations. Cost is also important, but again, the standard is reasonableness, not necessarily the lowest price. So fees should be reasonable and necessary for the services provided. Benchmarking against market standards and reviewing compensation structures is part of a prudent fiduciary process. Reputation and experience matter as well. A vendor's track record, industry standing, and depth of expertise can signal reliability and competence. And then finally, carefully reviewing contractual language, right? This isn't just up to legal counsel. You also want to make sure you understand what's in the contract. So contracts should clearly define roles and responsibilities to avoid confusion about fiduciary status and about accountability. So you've selected a vendor and now what? The job is over. Nope, not at all, right? ERISA says you have to do more than that. So under ERISA, fiduciary responsibility doesn't end once the contract is signed. Ongoing oversight is required to ensure that vendors continue to perform appropriately. So one way to monitor vendors is to establish clear performance metrics and also to put those metrics in the contractual language as well. So before you can evaluate a vendor, you need defined standards. So these may include service level agreements, turnaround times for claims processing, accuracy rates, participant satisfaction scores, reporting timelines, certain compliance benchmarks, and even some financial performance indicators. So if you set measurable expectations, that creates accountability and provides a framework for further evaluation down the road. Next, conducting regular performance reviews. So after you've set these benchmarks, follow up and make sure they're being accurately completed. So this might involve quarterly or annual review meetings, analyzing performance reports, reviewing fee disclosures, benchmarking costs, and discussing any service concerns directly with the vendor. Review should be structured and documented, demonstrating that fiduciaries are actively engaged in oversight rather than just being passive fiduciaries. And then finally, it's important to correct performance issues as soon as they arise. So if a vendor fails or falls short of expectations, fiduciaries must take action. And this includes requiring a corrective action plan, maybe renegotiating contract terms, increasing monitoring, or even if necessary, right, replacing the vendor altogether. But either way, ignoring known issues can create significant fiduciary risk. So as you've just seen, oversight is an ongoing cycle. Set expectations, review performance, and then address problems as they arise. But you're also entitled to certain disclosures that you can ask for, but they should also be freely given, right? Service providers who expect to receive at least $1,000 in compensation must provide written disclosures to the plan fiduciary in advance of entering into or renewing a contract. So these disclosures must clearly describe the services to be provided, state whether the service provider expects to act as a plan fiduciary, and outline all forms of compensation, both indirect and direct. Direct compensation might include flat fees, commissions, or per member per month charges paid by the plan. Indirect compensation could include revenue sharing, rebates, or payments from third parties, but understanding the full compensation structure is essential to ensuring that those fees are reasonable, right? As well as ensuring that there are no conflicts of interest. However, the obligation does not stop with the service provider, right? The service provider provides the disclosure, but then plan fiduciaries have an active duty to obtain the disclosures, review them carefully, and determine whether the compensation is reasonable in light of the services provided. So it's a two-step process after you receive those disclosures. In addition, fiduciaries must monitor compensation on an ongoing basis. So if compensation arrangements change, if there are updated disclosures, they should be actively reviewed. And if a service provider fails to provide required disclosures, fiduciaries may need to take corrective action as well. So moving on from vendor monitoring, I'm now going to take us through some common fiduciary struggles or pain points, as we like to call them, that cause most headaches for group health plans, and also describe the consequences of not addressing them head on. So here are some of the most common fiduciary pain points. I know there are many, right, but these are the most common ones. First, there is the sheer complexity of responsibilities. Fiduciaries must understand legal requirements, monitor vendors, review fees, oversee plan administration, ensure accurate communications, and then document everything along the way. So many employers are balancing these obligations alongside their core business operations, which can make fiduciary oversight feel overwhelming. Second is that ongoing oversight and monitoring that I touched on. So it's one thing to hire a vendor, but it's another thing to consistently evaluate their performance, benchmark costs, track service levels, and identify potential compliance gaps. Monitoring requires time, it requires structured processes, a level of bandwidth in terms of individuals involved, as well as, again, that clear documentation. So without a system in place, it's easy for important tasks to fall through the cracks. And then finally, conducting audits and facilitating disclosures can add another layer of complexity, whether it's responding to a Department of Labor inquiry, preparing for an internal audit, or reviewing required compensation disclosures. Fiduciaries must be prepared to demonstrate that they followed a prudent process. And so again, this often involves gathering all of that documentation, reviewing contracts, and it can be a very burdensome process. Here I've highlighted some common red flags that increase fiduciary risk. So a major concern is fragmented documentation or a lack of evidence showing ongoing governance. So Reagan touched on the documentation piece and the importance of it, but also there has to be a system in place to accurately keep all that documentation together and make sure that it's accessible when needed. Also, failure to distribute required notices on time is another risk area. ERISA mandates specific participant disclosures, and missed deadlines can lead to penalties as well as compliance issues. Another one is a committee that exists in name only. As I mentioned before, passive committees or passive fiduciaries. If it does not meet regularly or document its work, that is a red flag. Regulators expect active oversight, not just a formal designation. Another is lack of documented vendor comparisons before selection or failure to conduct ongoing monitoring. That signals weak fiduciary oversight. Similarly, not collecting or reviewing those required compensation disclosures can raise concerns about fee reasonableness and also the overall health of the benefit plan. And then finally, outdated plan documents or inconsistencies between written terms and actual administration can create significant exposure. Again, Reagan highlighted this, so I won't go into depth. But again, just making sure all of these pieces align is another key area that you want to ensure is on par with your benefit plan. So when processes break down, the risks extend beyond just compliance technicalities. So a Department of Labor audit can be time consuming, it can be disruptive, and most importantly, it can be costly, right? Especially if documentation is incomplete. Second, litigation, as we went through in the beginning, just like the cases reviewed earlier, participants may bring lawsuits alleging breach of fiduciary duty, particularly around fees, vendor selection, or denied claims. There is also brand and reputational harm, financial exposure, which again can include penalties, corrective payments, legal fees, or even settlements. And then finally, employee trust is at stake, right? Benefit plans are a core part of the employment relationship, and any mismanagement or even appearance of mismanagement can erode confidence in leadership, which can be difficult to rebuild as well. So how do we manage fiduciary risk, and how do we make the pain points a little less painful, right? This is where we show you the fiduciary checklist we've drafted. And it's pretty comprehensive. So I'm going to give a high level overview, but take what you need as you will as well. So here is a practical fiduciary checklist. Again, this focuses on governance, documentation, and compliance. Each of these points we've touched on in this presentation. So from a governance perspective, one of the most important steps is establishing a benefits committee that meets regularly, again, avoiding that passive committee and having an active one. On the documentation side, maintaining written records is critical. So committee meeting minutes, vendor evaluations, and key fiduciary decisions should all be documented. From a compliance and risk management standpoint, regular compliance assessments are essential. So that means periodically reviewing obligations under ERISA, COBRA, HIPAA, the ACA, et cetera, right? It helps identify gaps before they become liabilities. Auditing eligibility and claims processes can also uncover those operational issues early. Organizations also may want to consider fiduciary liability insurance as part of their broader risk management strategy, in addition to incorporating all of the duties and elements that ERISA requires. So this next portion of the fiduciary checklist is largely on that vendor selection and handling plan assets piece. So as we've discussed on the vendor side, improving both selection and ongoing monitoring is critical. So transparency around compensation is a big focus. Again, you must understand how vendors are paid to ensure there are no hidden conflicts or self-dealing arrangements. When it comes to handling plan assets, the standard is also clear here. Only reasonable and necessary fees should be paid for administration and vendor services. So fees must align with the value of services provided. And then lastly, participant contributions must be properly collected, handled in a timely manner in accordance with ERISA, and used solely for the benefit of plan participants, right? So delays or misuse of contributions can create significant fiduciary exposure. So there are several benefits of strong fiduciary governance, right? This isn't just a checklist of things to do and then there's no outcome. There are several benefits to ensuring that you are a proper fiduciary under ERISA standards. So it builds a defensible decision-making process. So organizations are better positioned to respond to audits or other plan-related challenges, right? Instead of taking years to respond, you can take a matter of even days, right? If you're properly organized. It also reduces surprises and helps identify issues early before they escalate. Proper fiduciary practices also strengthen participant trust. I mentioned that about a few slides ago, right? Demonstrating that the organization is acting responsibly and transparently. Importantly, it also helps prevent compliance gaps from turning into penalties or turning into litigation. But ultimately, good fiduciary governance just creates stability, and it's also a proactive risk management tool that protects the organization, it protects the plan, and it also protects the participants that the plan serves as well.
With that, Brianna, I just was checking questions to see if we had anything else that we should answer, and I don't see anything. So I think, Jenny, we'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you both. And thanks to our audience for this very timely topic. And I think this is going to continue to be a topic that many folks kind of keep an eye on. So with that in mind, we did record today's session. So as a reminder to our audience, if you are looking for a link to that recording, you can reach out to the benefits advisor who invited you here today. They will be able to provide you with that link here in the next couple of days. And again, thank you to those benefits advisors and consultants who are partners of Assurex Global for making today's webinar possible. That does conclude our time together today. Again, thank you to the Loomlight team. Thank you to our audience for tuning in and wishing you all a wonderful afternoon. Thanks again.